The helicopter blades cut through the thick Afghan night air as Chief Petty Officer Marcus Rodriguez checked his gear one final time. Beside him, 5 other Navy SEALs sat in focused silence, their faces painted with black camouflage that made them nearly invisible in the aircraft's dim red lighting. The mission briefing had been clear. Infiltrate a Taliban stronghold in the Kunar province. Gather intelligence on a high-value target, and extract before dawn. Rodriguez had been leading SEAL teams for 8 years. But something about this mission felt different. The intelligence was thin, based mostly on intercepted communications and satellite imagery that was already 3 days old. The target compound sat in a valley surrounded by steep mountains, with only one reliable extraction point. It was the kind of terrain that could turn from an advantage into a death trap in minutes. 23-year-old Petty Officer Jake Sullivan sat across from Rodriguez, nervously adjusting his night vision goggles. This was only his second deployment, and his first time operating in such hostile territory. The other team members, Thompson, Garcia, Williams, and Chen, were seasoned veterans who had completed dozens of similar missions together. They moved with the quiet confidence that came from years of training and combat experience. 5 minutes out, the pilot's voice crackled through their headsets. Rodriguez gave the hand signal for final equipment check. Each man verified his rifle, ammunition, communications equipment, and medical supplies. The plan was straightforward. Fast rope insertion 2 kilometers from the target, approach on foot under cover of darkness, conduct surveillance for 2 hours, then move to the extraction point for pickup at 0400 hours. The helicopter began its descent, flying low through the mountain valleys to avoid detection by enemy radar. The landscape below was a maze of rocky ridges, narrow valleys, and scattered villages where Taliban fighters could be hiding behind any wall or boulder. Intelligence reports suggested minimal enemy presence in the immediate area, but everyone knew how quickly that could change. As they approached the insertion point, Rodriguez felt the familiar surge of adrenaline mixed with calculated calm that had kept him alive through countless operations. The helicopter flared, hovering 30 feet above a small clearing surrounded by scrub brush and loose rocks. One by one, the SEALs fast roped to the ground, their boots hitting the dirt with practiced silence. Within seconds, the helicopter was gone, leaving only the whisper of rotor blades fading into the distance. The team immediately took defensive positions, scanning the surrounding area through their night vision equipment. The green-tinted world revealed no immediate threats, just the stark landscape of Afghanistan's eastern mountains. Rodriguez signaled for movement, and the team began their approach to the target compound. They moved in a tactical formation, spacing themselves to minimize casualties if they encountered enemy fire. The terrain was more challenging than the satellite imagery had suggested, with loose rocks that could easily shift underfoot and create noise that would alert enemy sentries. After 40 minutes of careful movement, they reached an observation point overlooking the target compound. Through their scopes, they could see a cluster of mud brick buildings surrounded by a low wall. Dim lights flickered in 2 of the structures, and they observed several armed guards patrolling the perimeter. The layout matched their intelligence briefings, but there were more guards than expected. Sullivan set up the team's communications equipment, establishing contact with their command center back at Bagram Airfield. "Overwatch, this is Shadow 6, Rodriguez whispered into his radio. "We have eyes on target, confirming visual surveillance." "Copy, Shadow 6, came the reply from their operations center. "Continue mission as planned. Weather reports show clear skies for extraction." For the next 2 hours, the team methodically documented the compound's activity. They photographed guard rotations, identified potential entry points, and recorded the movement of vehicles and personnel. The intelligence they gathered would be crucial for planning future operations against this Taliban cell. Thompson, the team's sniper, had positioned himself on higher ground to provide overwatch. Through his scope, he could see the entire valley and the routes they would need to take to reach the extraction point. Everything appeared normal until he noticed movement on the ridgeline opposite their position. "Rodriguez, Thompson's voice was barely audible through the radio. "We've got movement on the eastern ridge. Looks like a patrol. Maybe 6 individuals." Rodriguez immediately signaled for the team to prepare for movement. Their surveillance mission was complete, and they needed to reach the extraction point before the enemy patrol could compromise their position. The plan was to move through a narrow valley that would provide cover from observation, then climb to the extraction landing zone. The team began their movement in tactical bounds, with each member covering the others as they advanced from position to position. The rocky terrain made silent movement challenging, but their training had prepared them for exactly these conditions. They had covered about half the distance to the extraction point when Sullivan picked up radio chatter on his equipment. "Sir," Sullivan whispered urgently to Rodriguez, "I'm intercepting Taliban communications. Sounds like they know we're here." Rodriguez felt his stomach tighten. Compromised missions were every operator's nightmare, especially in terrain like this, where the enemy held every advantage. He signaled for the team to increase their pace while maintaining tactical discipline. They needed to reach the extraction point before enemy forces could surround them. The narrow valley that had seemed like perfect concealment now felt like a potential trap. High ridges on both sides could hide enemy fighters, and the rocky floor limited their options for defensive positions. As they moved deeper into the valley, Garcia spotted muzzle flashes on the ridge above them. "Contact left!" Garcia shouted, immediately returning fire toward the enemy positions. The night erupted in gunfire as Taliban fighters opened up from multiple positions along the ridgeline. Tracer rounds streaked through the darkness, and the sound of AK-47 fire echoed off the valley walls. The SEALs took cover behind the largest rocks they could find, but their position was dangerously exposed. Rodriguez keyed his radio while bullets whined overhead. "Overwatch. This is Shadow 6. We are in contact with enemy forces. Request immediate close air support and emergency extraction." The response was barely audible through the static and noise of gunfire. "Shadow 6. No air assets immediately available. Continue to extraction point. Helo will attempt pickup in 30 minutes. 30 minutes might as well have been 30 hours. The enemy fire was intensifying, and more fighters seemed to be arriving from other parts of the valley. The SEALs were vastly outnumbered and pinned down in an exposed position with limited ammunition and no air support. Williams, the team's medic, crawled between positions to redistribute ammunition and check on the others. A bullet had grazed Thompson's shoulder, but he continued to engage targets with his sniper rifle, picking off enemy fighters who exposed themselves on the ridgeline. Chen, their explosives expert, identified a small cave opening about 50 meters from their current position. It wasn't ideal, but it would provide better protection than their current rocks and boulders. Rodriguez made the decision to bound toward the cave, knowing they couldn't sustain their current position much longer. "On my mark, we move to that cave," Rodriguez shouted over the gunfire. "Sullivan, you're first. Go." Sullivan sprinted across the open ground while his teammates provided covering fire. He made it to the cave entrance just as enemy bullets chipped rock fragments from the walls around him. One by one, the others followed, with Rodriguez covering their withdrawal before making his own dash to safety. The cave provided better protection, but it also limited their options. They were no longer pinned down in the open, but they were effectively trapped. The entrance faced the valley floor, and enemy fighters could approach from multiple directions. Rodriguez tried his radio again, but static filled his headset. "Communications are down," Sullivan reported grimly. "Something's jamming our frequencies." Outside, they could hear voices shouting in Pashto as enemy forces organized for what sounded like a coordinated assault. The SEALs had walked into a carefully planned ambush, and now they were cut off from their command, with no way to call for help or coordinate their extraction. Rodriguez looked at his men, all of them breathing hard but maintaining their discipline despite the desperate situation. They had trained for scenarios like this, but training never fully prepared you for the reality of being trapped behind enemy lines with no communication and no immediate prospect of rescue. The sound of approaching footsteps outside the cave told them their time was running out. 200 miles away, at Bagram Airfield, Intelligence analyst Sarah Chen sat in the dimly lit communications center, staring at banks of radio equipment and computer screens that normally buzzed with constant chatter from units across Afghanistan. For the past hour, however, one frequency had gone completely silent. The channel assigned to Shadow 6, the SEAL team, that should have been reporting their successful extraction by now. Sarah had been tracking military communications for 3 years, but she had never lost contact with a team during an active mission. Her job typically involved monitoring enemy radio traffic and providing intelligence updates to field commanders, but tonight she found herself desperately trying to re-establish contact with 6 men whose lives might depend on her technical skills. Lieutenant Commander David Park, the Operations Center watch officer, paced behind her workstation with increasing agitation. "How long since last contact?" he asked for the 3rd time in 10 minutes. 47 minutes, Sarah replied, adjusting the gain on her radio receiver. Their last transmission was a request for air support and emergency extraction. Since then, nothing but static on their primary frequency. Park knew the statistics as well as anyone. SEAL teams that went silent during operations in hostile territory faced a 20% casualty rate, and those numbers got worse with every hour that passed without contact. He had already scrambled 2 Apache attack helicopters, but they couldn't provide effective support without knowing the team's exact location and status. Sarah switched between multiple radio frequencies, trying to pick up any transmission that might indicate the team's status. Military communications in Afghanistan were complicated by the mountainous terrain, which could block radio signals and create dead zones where even the most powerful equipment couldn't penetrate. The Kunar province, where Shadow 6 was operating, was particularly notorious for communication problems. "Try the backup frequencies," Park ordered. "Emergency channels, anything they might use if their primary equipment was damaged." Sarah had already tried the backup channels, but she methodically went through them again. Her training had taught her that persistence often paid off in seemingly hopeless situations, and she refused to give up on the 6 men who were counting on her to maintain their lifeline to safety. As she slowly turned the dial on her receiver, searching for any signal that might be Shadow 6, she began picking up fragments of Taliban radio traffic. The enemy communications were in Pashto, but she had studied the language extensively and could understand enough to piece together what was happening. "Sir," she said urgently to Park, "I'm intercepting Taliban communications. They're talking about American soldiers trapped in a cave. It has to be our team." Park moved closer to listen as Sarah translated the broken transmissions. The Taliban fighters were coordinating an assault on what they described as a small group of American Special Operations Forces who had taken shelter in a cave formation. The enemy was bringing in reinforcements and planning to wait until dawn before making their final attack. "Can you determine their location from the radio traffic?" Park asked. Sarah shook her head. "The transmissions are too fragmented, and they're using geographic references I'm not familiar with. But sir, there's something else. I'm picking up what sounds like electronic interference on several frequencies. It's not natural static. Someone's jamming communications in that area." 1. The realization hit both of them simultaneously. The Taliban had used communications jamming equipment to cut off the SEAL team's radio contact, which meant this wasn't a chance encounter, but a carefully planned ambush. The enemy had been waiting for an American unit to stumble into their trap. Park immediately contacted the Air Force liaison to request electronic warfare aircraft that could locate and neutralize the jamming equipment. But the nearest suitable aircraft was hours away. The SEAL team couldn't wait that long. Sarah continued monitoring the Taliban communications, building a clearer picture of the tactical situation. The enemy had positioned fighters on multiple ridgelines around the valley, where the SEALs were trapped. They were using the cover of darkness to maneuver additional forces into position for what sounded like an overwhelming assault at first light. "I'm not getting any response from Shadow 6 on any frequency," Sarah reported. "But the Taliban radio traffic suggests our people are still alive and fighting." She had an idea that was either brilliant or completely desperate. Military radios were designed to cut through normal static and interference, But the Taliban's jamming equipment might not be sophisticated enough to block all types of signals. Sarah began experimenting with different transmission modes, adjusting power levels and frequencies to find gaps in the enemy's jamming coverage. "What are you doing?" Park asked, watching her manipulate controls he didn't fully understand. "Trying to punch through their jamming," Sarah explained, her fingers dancing across the radio controls. "If I can find the right frequency and transmission mode, I might be able to get a signal through to them." For 20 minutes, she systematically tested different approaches, sending coded messages on various frequencies and listening for any response that might indicate the SEAL team could hear her transmissions. The work required extraordinary patience and technical skill, made more difficult by the knowledge that 6 lives hung in the balance. Then, buried in the static and interference, she heard it. 3 short clicks, followed by 2 long ones, then repeated. It was a simple code that every military communications operator learned, a way to acknowledge receipt of a transmission when normal voice communication wasn't possible. "I've got them," Sarah shouted, loud enough to draw stares from other operators in the communications center. "They're alive and receiving my signals." Park rushed to her side as Sarah began transmitting a series of coded questions using Morse code, a system old enough to penetrate the most modern jamming equipment. The responses came slowly, interrupted by long periods of static, but gradually she was able to establish basic communication with the trapped team. From their responses, she learned that all 6 team members were alive but pinned down in a cave with limited ammunition. They were surrounded by enemy forces and couldn't move to their original extraction point without being overrun. Worse, one team member was wounded and needed medical attention. Sarah relayed this information to Park, who immediately began coordinating a rescue mission. But the tactical situation was complicated. The original extraction point was compromised, and they needed to find an alternative location where helicopters could safely land while avoiding enemy fire. Working with the operations center's tactical experts, Sarah began transmitting map coordinates to the SEAL team, asking them to confirm whether alternative extraction points were accessible from their current position. The process was painfully slow, with each exchange taking several minutes due to the weak signals and constant interference. Meanwhile, the Taliban radio traffic she was monitoring indicated that the enemy was growing impatient. They had expected to overwhelm the Americans quickly, but the SEALs' defensive position in the cave was proving more difficult to assault than anticipated. However, the enemy commanders were bringing up heavier weapons that could blast the Americans out of their hiding place. "We're running out of time," Park said grimly. "The Apache helicopters are 30 minutes out, but they won't be effective without precise target coordinates." Sarah had another idea. If she could maintain communication with the SEAL team, they could provide real-time intelligence on enemy positions to guide the attack helicopters. It would require perfect coordination between the trapped team, her radio equipment, and the incoming aircraft. She began explaining the plan to the SEAL team through coded transmissions, asking if they could observe and report enemy positions while the helicopters approached. The response was immediate and affirmative. They were ready to turn their desperate situation into a tactical advantage. As she worked to maintain the fragile communication link, Sarah could hear the tension in the static-filled signals from the cave. The enemy was closing in, and the SEALs were down to their last magazines of ammunition. Everything depended on perfect timing and her ability to keep the communications working for just a few more minutes. The Apache helicopters were approaching the target area, but they needed precise guidance to avoid hitting the Americans while engaging the Taliban forces. Sarah became the critical link between the trapped team and their rescuers, translating fragmentary radio signals into the targeting information that would determine whether the mission ended in rescue or tragedy. Through her headphones, she could hear the sound of helicopter rotors mixing with gunfire and static, knowing that the next few minutes would determine the fate of 6 men who were counting on her technical skills and determination to bring them home. Inside the cave, Rodriguez could hear the Apache helicopters approaching through the mountains, their rotor blades echoing off the valley walls like distant thunder. But he also heard something more immediate and terrifying: the sound of Taliban fighters preparing for a final assault on their position. Through the cave entrance, he could see muzzle flashes moving closer as enemy forces advanced under cover of their own gunfire. Thompson, despite his wounded shoulder, had positioned himself at the cave mouth with his sniper rifle, picking off any Taliban fighter who exposed himself in the rocky terrain outside. Williams, the team medic, had used most of their medical supplies treating Thompson's wound and preparing for what looked like an inevitable close-quarters battle. Sullivan crouched over his radio equipment, desperately trying to maintain contact with the female analyst who had become their only lifeline to the outside world. The signal was weak and filled with static, but her coded transmissions were coming through clearly enough for him to understand her instructions. "She wants us to mark enemy positions for the helicopters," Sullivan whispered to Rodriguez. "We need to use our infrared markers to designate targets." Rodriguez understood immediately. The Apache pilots couldn't distinguish between American and Taliban forces in the darkness, especially with both sides using similar terrain for cover. The SEALs would have to expose themselves to enemy fire in order to mark targets for the helicopter's weapons systems. Garcia and Chen had been conserving their ammunition, taking careful shots only when they had clear targets. Now Rodriguez signaled for them to prepare their infrared markers, devices that were invisible to the naked eye, but could be seen clearly through the helicopter's targeting systems. "Thompson, can you see the main enemy positions from here?" Rodriguez asked. Thompson adjusted his scope, scanning the ridgeline where most of the Taliban fighters had positioned themselves. "I count at least 15 muzzle flashes on the eastern ridge, maybe 8 more on the western side. There's also a group moving up the valley floor toward our position." Rodriguez made the decision that would either save his team or get them all killed. They would have to leave the relative safety of the cave to place infrared markers on enemy positions, knowing that the Taliban fighters would see them coming and concentrate their fire on anyone who exposed themselves. "Garcia, you take the eastern ridge markers," Rodriguez ordered. "Chen, you've got the western positions. Sullivan, maintain radio contact and coordinate with the helicopters. Williams, you stay with Thompson and provide covering fire." The plan was simple but dangerous. Garcia and Chen would have to sprint across open ground under enemy fire, get close enough to the Taliban positions to place their markers, then return to the cave before the helicopters began their attack runs. The timing had to be perfect. Too early, and the enemy would discover and remove the markers. Too late, and the advancing Taliban fighters would overrun their position. Sarah's voice crackled through Sullivan's headset, barely audible through the static and interference. "Apache flight is 2 minutes out. Need target designation immediately." Sullivan relayed the message to Rodriguez, who gave the signal for Garcia and Chen to move. The two SEALs sprinted from the cave entrance, immediately drawing intense fire from the surrounding ridgelines. Bullets whined off the rocks around them as they zigzagged toward their assigned targets. Garcia reached the eastern ridge first, diving behind a boulder as Taliban fighters tried to zero in on his position. He could hear enemy voices shouting in Pashto, directing fire toward his location. Working quickly, he armed his infrared marker and threw it toward the largest concentration of muzzle flashes, then immediately began working his way back toward the cave. Chen faced a more difficult approach to the western positions, which were positioned on higher ground with better fields of fire. He had to climb over exposed rocks, while enemy bullets chipped fragments around him. Twice he had to take cover and return fire before continuing his advance toward the target area. From the cave, Thompson and Williams provided covering fire, trying to suppress the Taliban fighters long enough for their teammates to complete their mission. Thompson's sniper rifle picked off enemy fighters who exposed themselves to shoot at Garcia and Chen, while Williams used his rifle to keep the advancing ground forces from getting too close to the cave entrance. Rodriguez monitored the radio traffic between Sullivan and Sarah, knowing that the helicopter attack was their only chance of survival. The enemy was closing in from multiple directions, and they were down to their last few magazines of ammunition. If the air support didn't arrive in the next few minutes, the Taliban would simply overrun their position through sheer numbers. "Markers are in place," Garcia called out as he dove back into the cave, breathing hard from his sprint across the rocky terrain. Chen was having more difficulty with his return trip. Taliban fighters on the western ridge had identified his position and were concentrating their fire to prevent him from reaching the cave. He was pinned down behind a small outcropping of rocks, about 30 meters from safety, with enemy fighters moving to flank his position. "I can't move," Chen called out. "Too much fire." Rodriguez made another split-second decision. He grabbed his rifle and sprinted out of the cave toward Chen's position, drawing enemy fire away from his trapped teammate. Williams and Thompson increased their rate of fire, trying to suppress the Taliban fighters long enough for both men to reach safety. The sound of Apache helicopters grew louder, and suddenly the night sky erupted in streams of tracer fire as the attack aircraft engaged the marked targets. The 30mm cannon on the lead helicopter sent a devastating stream of high-explosive rounds into the eastern ridge position, silencing the Taliban fighters who had been pinning down Garcia. "Target acquired, engaging western ridge," Sarah's voice came through Sullivan's radio as she coordinated the helicopter attack from hundreds of miles away. The second Apache rolled in on the western positions, its rockets lighting up the night as they struck the Taliban fighting positions. The effect was immediate and overwhelming. Enemy fire slacked off dramatically as the survivors scrambled for better cover. Rodriguez reached Chen's position just as the helicopter attack eliminated most of the Taliban fighters on the western ridge. Together, they sprinted back to the cave while the Apache helicopters continued their attack runs, systematically destroying the enemy positions that had trapped the SEAL team. But the immediate threat wasn't over. The Taliban fighters on the valley floor had taken cover during the helicopter attack and were still advancing toward the cave. These fighters were too close to the Americans for the helicopters to engage safely, which meant the SEALs would have to deal with them using their remaining ammunition. "Ground forces still advancing," Thompson reported, tracking the enemy fighters through his scope. "Maybe 6 or 8 of them, 200 meters, and closing." Rodriguez assessed their situation quickly. The helicopter attack had eliminated most of the Taliban fighters, but they still faced a ground assault from the survivors. However, the air support had fundamentally changed the tactical situation. Instead of being trapped and outnumbered, they now had the advantage of superior firepower and position. Sullivan received new instructions from Sarah through his radio. "Extract team moving to alternate landing zone. Apache flight will provide cover during movement to pickup point." The extraction helicopters couldn't land near the cave due to the rocky terrain, but there was a suitable landing zone about 800 meters down the valley. The SEALs would have to fight their way through the remaining Taliban forces to reach the pickup point. But they now had attack helicopters, providing close air support. Rodriguez organized his team for the movement to the extraction point. Thompson, despite his wound, insisted he could make the movement on foot. Williams redistributed their remaining ammunition, giving each man enough rounds for the fighting withdrawal they would need to conduct. The Apache helicopters had identified the remaining Taliban fighters and were tracking their movements, relaying their positions to the SEAL team through Sarah's radio coordination. This gave the Americans a tremendous tactical advantage. They knew exactly where their enemies were located and could plan their movement accordingly. "Move in bounds," Rodriguez ordered. "Garcia and Chen first, then Williams and Thompson. Sullivan, you stay close to me and maintain radio contact." The team began their tactical movement toward the extraction point, with the Apache helicopters providing overwatch and engaging any Taliban fighters who tried to interfere. The few surviving enemy fighters were demoralized and disorganized after the devastating helicopter attack, and they offered only scattered resistance. As they approached the landing zone, Rodriguez could hear the distinctive sound of incoming transport helicopters. The extraction birds were escorted by additional attack aircraft, ensuring that the Taliban couldn't mount an effective counterattack during the pickup. Sarah's voice came through Sullivan's radio one final time as the extraction helicopters touched down in the landing zone. "Shadow 6, your ride is waiting. Safe travels home." The SEAL team reached the helicopters and quickly boarded, with Thompson receiving immediate medical attention from the aircraft's medic. As they lifted off from the valley floor, Rodriguez looked down at the terrain where they had nearly died, thinking about the female analyst, whose technical skills and determination had saved their lives. 6 months later, Sarah Chen received a personal visit from Chief Petty Officer Rodriguez and his team at Bagram Airfield. They presented her with a Bronze Star Medal for her actions that night. Recognizing her crucial role in their survival and successful extraction, Rodriguez shook her hand and said simply, "You brought us home." Sarah had never met any of the men whose voices she had heard through the static and interference of that desperate night. But she had formed a bond with them that would last the rest of their careers. Her technical expertise and refusal to give up had turned a potential tragedy into a successful rescue, proving that sometimes the most important battles are fought not with rifles and grenades, but with radio equipment and the determination to never abandon fellow soldiers in need. The mission became a case study in military communications schools, demonstrating how innovation and persistence could overcome even the most sophisticated enemy jamming equipment. But for the 6 SEALs who lived through that night, it remained a personal reminder that in the most desperate situations, their survival often depended on the skills and dedication of people they might never meet, but who were just as committed to bringing them home safely. The Taliban fighters who had planned the ambush learned a harsh lesson about the capabilities of American military technology and the determination of American military personnel. Their carefully planned trap had been turned against them, and their communications jamming had been defeated by an analyst who refused to accept that her team was lost. In his after-action report, Rodriguez wrote that the mission succeeded not because of superior firepower or advanced technology, but because of the human element. The refusal of one analyst to give up on 6 men she had never met, and her willingness to use every skill and tool at her disposal to guide them home through the static and chaos of a desperate night in Afghanistan.